your story, why it matters, and why it's needed. And I want to do something a little different this week. And you guys have heard Ali and I's story, excuse me, over the last, we're coming up on 2.5 years now. And our stories are good and our stories are powerful, but so are yours. And I really want to spend time talking to the community and about the importance of finding and knowing their story this week. So, Ali, when you think of somebody you meet, right? Like if you were going to tell me about somebody that you've known that I don't know, what's the first thing you would tell me about them?
I would probably tell you about their characteristics first. Um, yeah, like, oh man, this guy is awesome. And then I would jump right into their story, or at least what I know of their story, right? Like, oh, this guy is awesome, man. He has great energy. He is actually a blah, 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 and this and then about him. Yeah.
Yeah, you go right to their story, right? And at the end of that, even though I've never met them, I would start to identify with them. Right? It's the same like when we read a book and that lead character, you've never met this person, you've never even seen this person, but you're starting to conjure up images of them. And you feel like you know them. And that's the value and the importance of people's story, right? Like your story is kind of your calling card. And it's kind of what you're known for. But how can you share it if you don't take time to recognize it? Or even find value in your story, right? I think that's probably the first step we got to look at is I want everybody in our community to stop for a minute and realize your story is equal to everybody else's story. Right? Like we put people on pedestals, right? Like, oh man, you should hear their story. It's crazy. Yeah, it may be crazy, whatever they went through, but your story could have that same effect on somebody else.
So, Jerrod, how do we really like identify our story? Like, let's say, especially for someone, so I have a friend of mine, we had lunch a couple months ago, and we were actually talking about our childhoods and sharing our story. And he said something like, I don't have that. I've been really blessed where I haven't had like that much adversity or trauma. Like I grew up in a very, good neighborhood, really safe, and always had, my parents always had money and not too much adversity in his life. So he kind of felt that there wasn't that much to share from his story, or that his story wasn't very compelling. And I think he was kind of having a hard time with me in that conversation. I think only because I had shared some of mine, which was different than his story, right? That he felt his story wasn't as worth of sharing. And at the time, we were out to lunch, so we didn't really get too deep. But I felt like I told him like everyone's story is worth sharing, and that we can find value in all stories. But what would you say to someone like that of like, oh, well, I've had a pretty normal, right, quote unquote, normal life, not too much adversity. How would you tell them how they identify their story?
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think it's more common than we think where people don't realize their story has value. Right? A lot of people feel that way. And I would say this, like what were your obstacles? What were the hardships? Those are usually the pillars to your story. Right? And I don't care if you had the most perfect family ever, you had to overcome something. You had to do stuff, right? Or maybe you didn't. And maybe your story is of how to raise kids in a perfect environment because you experienced that. So that's what I want people to understand. Your experiences are your story.